You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. Between two-factor authentication, strong passwords, and a VPN, you try to be in control of how your info is protected. But many other places also have it, and they might not be as careful. That's why LifeLock monitors hundreds of millions of data points a second for threats. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit lifelock.com/podcast for 40% off. Terms apply.
When Plato invented the story of Atlantis, and he most certainly invented it as an allegory meant to illustrate how hubris can bring about the downfall of civilizations, he chose to place the origin of the tale in Egypt, saying that Solon, who was actually Plato's ancestor, had received the story from priests in Egypt, and that the priests knew the story because it had been inscribed on pillars in a temple there. As indicated in the first part of this series, the story recalls Herodotus's tale of receiving the history of Egypt from priests, and indeed, by some interpretations, the entire allegory was meant to counter the growing Greek view that their civilization was inferior to that of Egypt, or that Plato had taken his ideas about the ideal state from Egypt. By this interpretation, then, even though the story has it that Egyptians simply transmitted the story, Atlantis was actually meant to represent Egypt, to show that it was inferior to the quote-unquote perfect society of Athens, and that it had caused its own downfall. In inventing this story, he may have been inspired by the attempted Athenian conquest of Sicily, or perhaps by the very real destruction of Helike by tsunami, which saw an actual city-state sunk, or rather submerged, much like Atlantis is in his story. However, he had plenty of other models to inspire his story, since in Critias, it is clear that Zeus is responsible for the sinking of Atlantis, that he chose to punish Atlanteans for their corruption and godlessness. It is further apparent that Plato was reworking a flood myth, a widespread mythological motif in which a supernatural flood is sent by a god or gods to destroy a people or nation because of their corruption or hubris. Of course, when we think of a great flood today, because of the influence of the Bible on Western culture, we think of Noah's flood. But there were other precursor myths to the one that appears in Genesis. I spoke about this at length in my episode The Deluge and the Ark Seekers, in which I refuted the claim that a global flood occurred and that Noah's Ark was real. Plato was not the first Greek to imagine Zeus punishing hubris with a flood, for Greek myth held that Zeus had destroyed Arcadia with a deluge in his anger over a human sacrifice. And this myth appears to have migrated from the Babylonian flood myth seen in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which itself was derived from a Mesopotamian antecedent myth that likely only described the flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. But the Genesis flood myth was different. The corruption that warranted the flood of Noah was not hubris, but rather something very strange: the mingling of peoples, intercourse between fallen angels and human women, and the issue of unnatural offspring who were giants. Later Apocrypha would expand on the myth, with the first man, Adam, having foretold the flood, and with these angels or watchers having revealed ancient knowledge and the secrets of the universe to mankind. And these ancient secrets having been preserved, such as in Plato's tale of Atlantis, upon pillars that some would say were in Egypt. Just one problem, though, as both Plato and Herodotus asserted, and as the pyramids themselves demonstrated, civilization in Egypt was older than the flood, older even than Eden and the date of creation by any calculation at the time. Does the very existence of the pyramids then destroy biblical literalist views of history? This is Historical Blindness. I'm Nathaniel Lloyd, and the answer, unfortunately, is no, since Egyptian pyramids are now dated to between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago, well within the 6,000-year range of biblical literalists. But Jewish writers in antiquity and Christian and Gnostic writers in late antiquity and Muslim writers in the Middle Ages were working from an exaggerated timeline and would go to extreme lengths to reconcile the pyramids with their religious doctrines. And this would prove to be a major vector in the development of falsehoods about Egypt and the pyramids. Thank you for listening to Pyramidiocy, Part 2, The Pillars of Wisdom. Before we start, I want to apologize for my voice in this episode. Moving to a weekly schedule means recording more often, and that means having to record while I'm sick. Hopefully you can't hear it. I want to thank my new patrons, Simon Sevier and Adelaide Billy. Patrons of the show get access to a special feed with ad-free and exclusive minisodes. I typically release a patron exclusive around twice a month. For example, after my series on Shakespeare, I released a minisode about someone who wrote to me wanting me to promote his claims that Charles Dickens didn't write A Christmas Carol. And after my episode on Pythagoras and numerology, I looked at some of the claims about Stonehenge that mirror the wild ideas of pyramidologists. That one's a great preamble for this series, so check it out. If you hear the word minisode and think these pieces are insubstantial, they're actually fully produced and researched episodes, usually around 10 to 15 minutes in length. And I intend to keep producing around 2 a month, even if I am able to move the podcast to a weekly schedule. Patron feeds also get episodes early, and as mentioned, their episodes are not interrupted by advertisements or Patreon pitches like this. So visit patreon.com/historicalblindness and support the show. Or you can support what I do with a one-time gift donation at historicalblindness.com/donate, or at the PayPal link in the show notes, or on Venmo at Historical Blindness. Now, on with the episode. Welcome to Historical Blindness. To think that Jewish theologians did not know how to account for Egypt in their theology is rather surprising. After all, Egypt plays a very large part in the Bible. Abraham lives there for a long time and interacts with a pharaoh. Abraham's great-grandson Joseph is carried into captivity there but rises to become a vizier. The Israelites are said to have been enslaved there, and Moses is raised in the family of a pharaoh. Plagues are brought down on Egypt before the Israelites are liberated. King Solomon later marries a pharaoh's daughter, and his son Rehoboam is said to have lost the Ark of the Covenant to Egyptian pharaoh Shishak. Even the New Testament has Joseph and Mary taking the baby Jesus into Egypt to escape the wrath of Herod. Even in these canonical scriptures, Egypt is portrayed as a place of evil magics, with the pharaoh surrounded by sorcerers capable of wielding magic that rivals Moses' demonstrations of God's power. And yet no mention is made of pyramids whatsoever. With the Israelites said to have been enslaved, one notion was that the Israelites had been forced to build the pyramids. After all, Exodus mentions them, quote, at their hard labor, end quote, and even describes an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, for which Moses kills him. Along with Herodotus's phrasing, this proves to be the origin of the myth about pyramids being built by slaves. In fact, there is no archaeological evidence to support the claim that Israelites were enslaved in Egypt. But granting this premise, the Bible does not say what the Israelites did in their labors, and it makes no explicit mention of pyramids or structures that could be interpreted as pyramids. This has not stopped believers from seeing pyramids in the text. For example, it is argued that the word Migdal, or tower, the same word used to refer to that other great monolith, the Tower of Babel, would have been used to refer to the pyramids. And furthermore, since certain verses refer to a place called Migdal, this must be a reference to Giza. To make this argument, one has to entirely disregard the context of every mention of these separate places called Migdal, which were in each case placed in relation to other locations that show it was not Giza. So where were the pyramids? If they weren't in Exodus, perhaps they could be found in Genesis. Of course, if Egypt and the pyramids did not conform to biblical views of chronology, a believer could always assert that God had created them already assembled on the earth in order to test the faiths of believers, as he had those pesky dinosaur bones. But for all their ignorance of science and magico-religious beliefs, even the ancients did not stoop to that sort of stupidity. That is a very modern sort of nonsense. Instead, they failed to question their own preconceptions about history when faced with evidence of a civilization of far greater antiquity than they had imagined possible, and sought to demonstrate that it must not have been so very old as was claimed. According to their own ancient traditions, the very first king in Egypt had been named Mizraim, and this name served also as the Hebrew name for the country. In truth, there is strong reason to believe that this was a kind of personification, as the root name, Mizr, meant land, and the dual form, Mizraim, meant two lands, which you may recall from the previous episode was actually what the Egyptians themselves called their land. Mizraim was in the Bible, in Genesis 10, as a grandson of Noah, the second son of Ham, and this made for a great way to shoehorn Egypt into Genesis, such that Egypt became the land to which Ham, the wicked son of Noah, went after being cursed. Thus, Ham was said to be the founder of Egypt, and his son Mizraim its first king. This notion would also eventually feed into the insidious myth that because Ham had not averted his gaze from his father's drunken nudity, and because his son Canaan was therefore cursed to be a slave to Ham's brothers, Ham was the progenitor of all black people, and that black people had therefore all been cursed to endure slavery. This terrible falsehood would be bolstered in the 17th century by those who tried to prove Ham's connection with Africa, or specifically Egypt, through inaccurate etymology, claiming Ham was derived from a Hebrew word for black, or from an Egyptian word for servant, or even from that other name for Egypt, Kemet, the Black Land, which, of course, as I stated before, is a reference to the rich soil of Egypt, not to skin color. The name Egypt came from a Greek word that referenced the inhabitants' skin color, and like all those other words, was not clearly connected to the name Ham in any way. Additionally, it's just contradictory that the myth about Ham's sons being cursed to be slaves derives from another myth about Ham's sons being the first kings of the greatest kingdom in human history. A further problem with identifying Ham's Mizraim with Mizraim, the first king of Egypt, was that there were no records in king lists of a Mizraim being a pharaoh. According to Manetho's king lists, the first king in Egypt was named Menes, but he was just the first human king, as Manetho traces god kings back untold thousands of years further. Other Greek writers claimed an even longer history for Egypt, stretching back some 50 millennia. Some later chronologists sought to resolve this discrepancy by recalculating the history of Egypt. According to Jewish and Christian traditions, Egypt's history could not have stretched back so very many thousands of years, because only a couple thousand years were thought to have passed between creation and the flood. With Manetho's account of gods reigning on earth for nearly 25,000 years, Christian historians of late antiquity, like Sextus Julius Africanus and Eusebius of Caesarea, would try to resolve this by claiming that, after all, Manetho and the composers of Egyptian king lists had relied on lunar months, which were mistaken for solar years, and that is why their numbers were so inflated. I'm not sure how you'd mistake the two, since they're night and day. But such a rationalization was good enough for many a believer to just forget about the inconsistency. Others, however, sought some further reconciliation, reasoning that perhaps, after all, the pyramids and Egyptian civilization predated the Great Flood, leading inexorably back to the weird story of the quote-unquote sons of God impregnating the quote-unquote daughters of men with giants, or Nephilim. In Hellenistic Egypt and the Egypt of late antiquity, as syncretism had birthed many divergent religious myths, and belief in magic was giving birth to strange legends, the story of these giants exploded in popularity. With the appearance of certain apocryphal works, the Book of Jubilees, the Book of Enoch, and the Book of Giants, the myth of antediluvian giants grew exponentially. No longer called the sons of God, they became known as egregori, or watchers. Long had there been doctrinal disputes over who the sons of God had been, whether truly angels or just men, and you can hear all about that in my series on giants, No Bones About It. What the apocryphal legend did was confirm that the Watchers were fallen angels, list their names, and detail their activities, which would conclude in their destruction in the flood. Not only did they consort with human women and produce giant offspring, or Nephilim, which may not even be correctly translated as giants, but these offspring were evil, and their ghosts still haunt the earth, such that the story became a kind of demonology. It was claimed the Watchers taught humanity astrology and other ancient secrets, and with the loss of hieroglyphic literacy already underway and Egyptian inscriptions already being thought of as secret and inaccessible knowledge that had been preserved since antiquity, it was not a far leap to the notion that the Watchers had built the pyramids, or considering its size, perhaps their giant children had done so. There was, for example, a myth about these giants having survived the flood to build the Tower of Babel. So why not the Great Pyramid too? And after all, looking at hieroglyphs, it's clear that some figures are carved extremely large, while others are very small. So, giants, right? Well, no. Without an understanding of hieroglyphs, they did not recognize that the larger figures were just being emphasized as important, a technique called hieratic scale. Legends about fallen angels and giants would never stop being attached to the pyramids, and neither would the myth that they had been built to preserve ancient and evil knowledge, like astrology. That may not seem so sinister today, but the sorcery of divining the future by examining the heavens was certainly considered an evil science or magic by some back then. It is from this notion about hieroglyphs having been inscribed in pyramids to preserve these sinister secrets that we derive the modern numerological pyramidology claims about pyramids revealing advanced ancient wisdom and intelligence. This myth originates in the old legend of the Pillars of Wisdom, hearkening back to Plato's story about the history of Atlantis being inscribed on ancient pillars in Egypt, and corresponding to the notion that hieroglyphs represented the ancient secrets of the Watchers. The prevalent belief that hieroglyphs contained secret wisdom or magical formulae cropped up in the work of 1st century CE Roman Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who in his Antiquities of the Jews shares an apparent long-standing tradition that the descendants of Adam and Eve had taken steps to preserve an ancient and sacred wisdom that had been imparted to them. In this version of the Genesis story, which would be further developed in apocryphal traditions such as appear in works like the Testament of Adam, the Apocalypse of Adam, the conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan, and the Cave of Treasure, Adam is not just a simple fool who is easily led astray by the corruptive influences of Eve and the serpent. No, Adam was the wisest of sages because he had been in the presence of God. The secrets of the universe had been shared with him, and he in turn shared them with his son. This good son was not Abel, who had been killed by the wicked son Cain, but rather his youngest son, Seth, and Seth's sons or descendants, the Sethites, who kept the faith unlike the sinful descendants of Cain, kept also the celestial knowledge passed down from their forefathers and took heed of a very specific prophecy of Adam's, that the world would be destroyed in a flood. According to Josephus, in order to preserve their knowledge, they inscribed them onto 2 columns or pillars called stelae, one of brick and the other of stone. Josephus would state that these pillars were located in the, quote, land of Siriad, end quote, yet another term that was taken to mean Egypt, since it appears to refer to the star Sirius, which was sacred among Egyptians. Then the fact that Eusebius would later use the term stelae to refer to pyramidal monuments cemented the notion that the Sethites built the pyramids to survive a flood they knew was coming and inscribed them with all the secret knowledge of the universe. Now for a brief intermission. As listeners of Historical Blindness, you're no strangers to the fact that history is a lens through which we can better understand the present. Or as Shakespeare put it, what's past is prologue. History is the indispensable context without which we cannot hope to truly understand current events. You understand that, and so do the creators of the American Scandal podcast. Every season, they immerse listeners in the biggest controversies in U.S. history, helping us understand America's dark side and learn from its troubled past. Its latest season, Ruby Ridge Standoff, delves into an incident that sowed the seeds for the rise of the modern radical right. It transports you to 1992, where in a remote corner of Idaho, federal law enforcement surround a small cabin. They've come for Randy Weaver, a survivalist who took his family to the mountains in anticipation of the apocalypse. A simple weapons charge brought the agents here, but the situation is about to explode into a deadly and tragic standoff that will later become a rallying cry for far-right extremists, fueling distrust and violent anti-government sentiment for decades. Follow American Scandal on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can binge all episodes of American Scandal's Ruby Ridge Standoff early and ad-free right now on Wondery Plus. Every summer, I'm careful to avoid getting burned. My summer plans always include applying sunscreen so I can attend barbecues and protests without worrying about getting scorched. And when I make my plans by making phone calls, I also don't want to get burned by an outrageous wireless bill. That's why I switched to a Mint Mobile plan and saved enough to take a summer vacation. With Mint, I found no difference in speed or coverage, just a big difference in cost. And right now, you can switch to a Mint wireless plan like me to avoid sweating those surprise charges and overages. You'll just be chillin' with Mint's offer of 3 months premium service on the nation's largest 5G network for just $15 a month. With high-speed data and unlimited talk and text, it might just be the coolest thing happening this summer. This year, skip breaking a sweat and breaking the bank. Get this new customer offer and your 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month at mintmobile.com/blindness. That's mintmobile.com/blindness. Upfront payment of $45 required, equivalent to $15 a month. Limited time new customer offer for first 3 months only. Speeds may slow above 35 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details. Now, back to the show. Of course, none of this is history. It's mythology, made up thousands of years after the construction of the pyramids in an effort to fabricate a biblical history of the tombs that so thwarted theologians' efforts to explain them away. With the eventual decipherment of hieroglyphs, clearly it is entirely false that the purpose of the pyramids was to serve as some kind of sacred book that held within it the secrets of ancient knowledge. Actual inscriptions in pyramids, like those preserved at Saqqara, or pyramid texts as they are called, simply recorded the accomplishments of the pharaohs interred therein, with the only magical spells being merely sacerdotal rituals meant to ensure that the deceased would transition properly into the afterlife. But Josephus's purpose was not only to explain away those pesky pyramids. His version also revised the received story of Genesis, asserting the quote-unquote sons of God who impregnated the quote-unquote daughters of men with Nephilim, or giants, were actually the Sethites, those who had kept the faith and the wisdom of Adam, who had been seduced by the wanton women of the Canaanites. In one fell swoop, he rewrote the whole affair, such that the ancient and secret knowledge was not some evil sorcery, but rather the wisdom of God, preserved from the flood on pillars, or perhaps pyramids, by a godly antediluvian people. What we see Josephus doing, modifying ancient traditions to better suit a modern world and his own sensibilities, and even changing the identities of the central characters, is a process that would result in the myths about the pyramids changing and evolving, embraced by one people and then another, always taking the figures credited and identifying them as actually having been someone from their own traditions. In the apocryphal works that so popularized the story of the Watchers, it was one particular Sethite, Enoch, whom one tradition claimed was the inventor of astrology. You can hear me talk a great deal about the figure of Enoch and the unbelievable lore that surrounds him in my previous episode, The Secrets of Enoch. What's relevant here is that in the apocryphal Book of Jubilees, Enoch interacts with the Watchers and tries to reform them, and in the Book of Giants, it is Enoch who inscribes secret prophecies onto tablets. This would eventually translate into Enoch having been the engraver of the Pillars of Wisdom, and the legend of the Enochian Pillars is still widely repeated today as part of the highly metaphorical rituals of Freemasonry. And starting in the 3rd century CE, as Christianity spread in Egypt, and especially that hotbed of syncretism, Alexandria, we would find that Enoch came to be identified with none other than the father of alchemy, Hermes Trismegistus. Again, you can hear me talk in great detail about Hermes Trismegistus in my episode on him. But what's important here is to recognize that his eventual identification with Enoch was only the next step in a long history of syncretistic combination. The figure of Hermes Trismegistus had long been a composite. For hundreds of years, through the process of interpretatio Graeca, he had emerged as an amalgamation of the Egyptian god of wisdom, Thoth, and the Greek god Hermes, giving birth to a new religion and school of philosophy, Hermeticism, from which the practices of alchemy sprang. Through the centuries, Hermes Trismegistus went from being a Hellenized deity to being thought of more as a human sage who had really existed and taught secret wisdom. And then, with the spread of Christianity in the region, we see him become Christianized and identified with Enoch, who, like both Hermes and Thoth before him, had already been credited with secret knowledge and the preservation of wisdom. Additionally, apocryphal traditions claimed that after being quote-unquote taken by God, he was actually spirited away to a faraway place, which was interpreted as Egypt, where Enoch was said to have become the sage Hermes Trismegistus. According to an early medieval Egyptian Jewish legend, Hermes Trismegistus had erected and inscribed the many obelisks of Egypt, called the, quote, needles of the pharaoh, end quote, with, quote, the secrets of the sciences he had discovered, end quote, clearly echoing the legend of Enoch's pillars. And the legend of Hermes Trismegistus, as well as his identification with Enoch, would only be further developed after the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century CE. Unsurprisingly, Muslims were interested in the majestic pyramids at Giza and elsewhere, as well as temples and other monuments, and their mystery was deepened by the fact that it seemed no Copts, those descended from the native peoples of the land, seemed to know anything with certainty about them and their inscriptions. As Hermeticism became popular among Arab Egyptians, they further developed the myth of Hermes. Statues of the step pyramid architect Imhotep, depicted with a tablet inscribed with hieroglyphs, were mistaken for statues of Hermes, and the myth of Hermes Trismegistus's emerald tablet, inscribed with the secrets of his sciences, was born. This, of course, corresponded nicely to the legend of the Pillars of Wisdom, so rumors abounded that the Great Pyramid was actually the tomb of Hermes Trismegistus / Enoch. And within could be found the secret of secrets, his occult knowledge, written in a book or inscribed on tablets, as well as the mythical MacGuffins of alchemy, the Philosopher's Stone, and the Elixir of Life. In the 9th century, a caliph ordered the Great Pyramid opened, but it was sealed so tightly, hermetically you might say, because again, it was a tomb, that the caliph's men had to break stones and tunnel in. Inside, according to competing traditions, they perhaps found Khufu's treasures, or nothing, and discovered a mummy clutching a book or tablet. Surely Hermes Trismegistus himself, or more likely, Khufu, whom Manetho had more than 1,000 years earlier credited with writing a sacred book. But we see this image echoing through the legends of Hermes Trismegistus, who was said to have been entombed with his tablet of secrets. While Arab Hermeticists had taken the lore about Enoch/Hermes and run with it, Christians and Jews from late antiquity to the early Middle Ages moved away from their apocryphal stories about antediluvian demons and giants and Bible patriarchs as astrologers and alchemists, and developed a new explanation of the pyramids that might just be the most ridiculous one ever. They looked to one of the canonical stories of the Bible that center around Egypt, that of Joseph. Genesis tells us of Joseph's enslavement in Egypt, and during his captivity, he was falsely accused of rape by his master's wife, whose attempts to seduce him he had rebuffed. Thereafter, in prison, he demonstrated his talent at interpreting dreams to the Pharaoh's cupbearer. And when the Pharaoh himself had a strange dream about 7 emaciated cows whom he observes swallowing 7 fat cows, and of 7 withered ears of corn devouring 7 healthy ears of corn, Joseph is called on to interpret the dream. Joseph tells the Pharaoh that his dream foretells the coming of 7 years' prosperity and abundance, followed by 7 years of deprivation. In order to prepare for the coming famines, Joseph advised the Pharaoh to stockpile grains. The Pharaoh puts such stock in Joseph's prediction that he makes Joseph his chief official, or vizier, and places Joseph in charge of storing the grains. For 6 years, then, Joseph oversaw the putting by of surplus grains, and when the famine began, just as he'd foretold, even people from surrounding lands came to Egypt for food and were directed to Joseph and his stockpiles. Long had Jews and Christians searched the Bible for any mention of the pyramids. Tortuous had been their rationalizations to explain not only their great antiquity, but even their very existence. The very notion that they were great monuments to antediluvian demons and their abominable giant offspring flew in the face of their beliefs, and just as distasteful was the notion that they marked the resting places of pagan kings. Eventually, someone hit on the story of Joseph and came to the surprising conclusion that he had built the pyramids. According to their logic, in order to store grains, Joseph must have built great storehouses or granaries. Therefore, Joseph had built the pyramids to store grains ahead of the famine he had predicted. Just as it had been more desirable to Jews, Christians, and Muslims that they had been built by the patriarch Enoch, so too it was very pleasing to think that the pyramids were not the tombs of pagans, but rather the great accomplishment of this celebrated Hebrew figure. There may also have been some syncretism involved with the development of this legend, as Eusebius reports that Jews and Christians in Egypt identified Joseph with the Hellenized Egyptian deity Serapis, who was associated with the provision of grain. Serapis was also associated with death, though, which meant he was associated with pyramids, as they were known to be tombs. Regardless of how this legend appeared, though, it waned in the Middle Ages, as it was simply impossible to credit. While some might say that pyramids could not be tombs because they were all empty, evidence that all pyramids were tombs is too abundant, as is evidence that they are empty because they were long ago looted. Moreover, though empty, pyramids are not hollow. They are almost entirely solid, each with only a warren of narrow passages and rooms. Therefore, they would not have held much grain. Lastly, if the myth were to be credited, it would mean that the pyramids were constructed within only 6 years, which even Herodotus would have found hard to believe. By the 17th century, the idea that pyramids were Joseph's granaries was mostly considered laughable. And yet, we must never underestimate the potential for laughably false ideas to persist even into modern day. As an example, in 2016, then Republican presidential frontrunner Ben Carson came under fire in the media after video of a commencement speech he'd given in 1998 at a private Seventh-day Adventist university came to light. In the speech, he promoted the idea that the pyramids were Joseph's granaries.
My own personal theory is that Joseph built the pyramids in order to store grain. Now, all the archaeologists think that they were made for the pharaoh's graves, but, it would have to be something awfully big. When you stop and think about it, I don't think it would just disappear over the course of time to store that much grain.
And when asked about it, he doubled down.
It's still my belief, yes.
Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, well, the pyramids were made in a way that they had hermetically sealed compartments. You wouldn't need hermetically sealed compartments for a sepulcher. You would need that if you were trying to preserve grain over a long period of time. Some people believe in the Bible, like I do, and don't find that to be silly at all, and believe that God created the earth and don't find that to be silly at all. The secular progressives try to ridicule it anytime it comes up, and they're welcome to do that.
You heard him. We are welcome to ridicule his manifestly false claims. This just goes to show that there may be no idea too disproven or outdated to be promoted by religious conservatives. And as we've seen, many of the biggest myths and misconceptions about pyramids originate in misguided religious beliefs. Thank you for listening to Historical Blindness. Check out my main source for this episode, The Legends of the Pyramids, Myths and Misconceptions About Ancient Egypt by Jason Colavito. And check out his blog at jasoncolavito.com. Check out the blog post for this episode, which should go up on historicalblindness.com before the next episode releases, with a transcript, related imagery, and citations for further reading. As always, thanks go out to my partner patrons, Diane Lane, Robert Fisher, Joe Escott, Sean Munger, Devlin Hoff, Michael Markham, Jessica Reeves, Fred R. Groteis, Robin Naggett, Rebecca, Don Mundus, Eunice Allen Bradley, Juliet O'Connor, Jonathan Williams, Joshua Luddington, Logan Houlihan, Lily Powers, John Gowen, Lonnie Coffer, Emma, Kevin Osborne, Benny Slater, That One Girl, Jocelyn Clausen, Lindsay McAllister, Christine LeBlanc, Louise Rickshaw, an anonymous partner patron, and Prickly Pear. You patrons have probably listened to all the episodes I mentioned in this one, making your understanding of the myths and legends feeding into pyramid lore even greater. This is what the purveyors of pyramid nonsense lack: a clear understanding of the origin of all the myths they spew on podcasts and social media. Share this series with the next person you see claiming pyramids are repositories of ancient secret wisdom. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows, like The Constant and The Conspirators. Some music on this episode is by Kai Engel, licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Check out the show notes for a list of the tracks used. You can support the show by pledging on Patreon or by making a one-time donation on PayPal. Find those links in the show notes, or find me on Venmo at Historical Blindness. Until next time, think about this. In the story of the pyramids and the false ideas about them, There are many causes, including syncretism and the inevitable loss of memory over time. But there are two major villains here perpetuating these lies as well. One is the loss of literacy, and the other is religious dogma. And doesn't that tell us a lot about the spread of misinformation generally?
What does Sputnik have to do with student loans? How did a set of trembling hands end the Soviet Union? How did inflation kill moon bases? And how did a former president decide to run for a second non-consecutive term? These are among the topics we deal with on the My History Can Beat Up Your Politics podcast. We tell stories of history that relate to today's news events. Give a listen. My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, wherever you get podcasts.
This is Jen
and Jenny
from Ancient History Fangirl, and we're here to tell you about Jenny's scorching historical romantasy based on Alaric of the Visigoths, Enemy of My Dreams. Amanda Boucher, best-selling author of the Kingmaker Chronicle, says, quote, "This book has everything: high-stakes action, grit, ferocity, and blazing passion. Julia and Alaric are colliding storms against a backdrop of the brutal dangers of ancient Rome. They'll do anything to carve their piece out of this treacherous world and not just survive, but rule."
Enemy of My Dreams is available wherever books are sold.